The original circuit groovebox developed something of a cult following thanks in large part to Novation's relentless updates. So it was no surprise that the company decided to give it a proper sequel earlier this year. What was a surprise, though, was that along with the circuit tracks, Novation also announced the Circuit Rhythm, an entirely sample-based instrument. The rhythm combines the simplified, screen-free workflow that made the circuit so popular with the full-featured sampler and performance effects that clearly were inspired by the SP303 and SP404. The big question is whether or not what makes the circuit so compelling when playing and sequencing synths translates to chopping up loops and capturing own shots. Physically, the circuit rhythm and circuit tracks are nearly identical. The faceplate is light gray instead of black, and some of the labels on the controls are different, but they rebuilt on the same core platform. The front has the same 32 RGB velocity-sensitive pads, along with 28 buttons for switching views and tracks, plus 8 endless encoders for changing various parameters, and 2 knobs dedicated to volume and the master filter. Around back you'll also find 5-pin MIDI in, out and through ports, USB-C for power and connecting to your computer, a 3.5mm sync jack for connecting Volcas and the like, a headphone jack, and 1/4-inch stereo ins and outs. Oh, and of course there's a rechargeable battery that Novation says should last up to 4 hours. In my testing I haven't quite hit that mark, but I haven't been too far off either, about 3 to 3.5 hours. Then the core of the rhythm is its 8 monophonic sampler tracks. And, even though there are only 8 tracks, you can use sample flip to place multiple samples on a single track. For instance your kick and snare, so long as they don't overlap. All of this is pretty impressive considering the Circuit Rhythm's $400 price tag and portable size. But what seems great on paper doesn't always translate to the real world. That being said, Novation did do a lot right. For one, it's important that the company saw fit to build an actual sampler and not just a sample-based groovebox, like Elektron's model samples. Don't get me wrong, I love the model samples. But if you're looking to spontaneously sample something you've been jamming on, or to chop up soul loops, it's not gonna help you. The actual workflow for sampling and then doing basic editing, chopping, etc. is pretty easy to wrap your head around too. In fact, I'd go so far as to call it fun. I've definitely been in a creative rut recently, and stepping out of my comfort zone to slice up samples from YouTube and make some lo-fi and boom-bap inspired beats has helped me get back to enjoying making music again, even if what I am making is objectively not good. The 32-step circuit sequencer also remains a strong suit. It's simple, intuitive and deceptively powerful. You can program a beat manually or play it in unquantized. You can automate most of the parameters across a pattern, then chain patterns together to create longer progressions. Beyond that there are scenes, which consist of different pattern chains, which can themselves be chained together to create full arrangements. When creating patterns you can also introduce variation and unpredictability by using the probability parameter. This sets the chance that a particular step will be played. It's not quite as robust as Elektron's trig conditions, but it can keep things from getting too stale. And, if you're feeling a bit stuck, you can intelligently remix a pattern with the mutate function. It scrambles up your sequence to make something new, though the results aren't always great and there's no undo, so make sure to duplicate your pattern first. In general the mutate felt more useful on the synth-based circuit tracks than on the rhythm, but anything that can introduce a bit of randomness is good in my book. While obviously the whole point of a sampler is to record and perform with your own samples, I do have to give Novation credit for the stock sound selection. Most of your bases are covered from acoustic drums, to 808s, to guitar licks, electric piano and synth pads. And they sound good too, which is not something you could say about the presets on the circuit tracks. Basically, no matter what genre of music you make, there should be enough here to get you started. While the basic workflow of the circuit rhythm and tracks are basically identical, there are some differences. There are specific pages for recording and processing samples, for instance, and a page dedicated to what Novation calls grid effects, which are basically punch-in effects like repeat, gate and vinyl simulation that give you basic tools for manipulating your beat. But, just like the tracks, some of the more advanced features aren't always immediately obvious, and having the manual handy is a must while you're refining your bearings. I am sure that eventually I'd be able to commit most functions to memory, but after a few weeks I am still having trouble remembering how to turn threshold on and off when recording samples. It took me forever to figure out how to manually play slice points, and I still haven't figured out how to set a count in for unquantized recording. The effects are also something of a mixed bag here. The delay, reverb and sidechain effects are all the same as on the tracks. They reach charmingly lo-fi, but the line between barely noticeable and over-the-top is extremely thin. And the grid effects are pretty mediocre. The vinyl sim is passable, but the beat repeat and gate effects always felt slightly out of sync. It's entirely likely that I just haven't mastered performing with the rhythm yet, but I don't struggle nearly as much with the same effects on Teenage Engineering SP033. There are some features that would be super useful too that I am hoping to see Novation add in a future firmware update. For one, the ability to swap or adjust grid effects from the device itself would be huge. You can load up to 16 of them, but they're all presets, so you can change the depth of the flanner, for instance, without connecting to the components app on your computer. This also means that if you start a new pack on the circuit you're stuck with the default effects. Fine-grained control over the tempo is also a must that's currently missing. I spent well over an hour trying to line up a sample from Stradulum theme off the soundtrack to the Visitor, but no matter what I did I couldn't quite get it to loop cleanly. The actual BPM of the sample is somewhere between 85 and 86 BPM, but the rhythm will only deal in whole numbers. The circuit rhythm is far from perfect, but definitely offers a lot of compelling features at a decent price. The question, ultimately, is what features are most important to you? The model samples is $100 cheaper at $299 and its sequencer blows the circuit out of the water, if you ask me. But it's not as finger drum friendly, plus it doesn't have built-in sampling capabilities or a battery. Core gas electric sampler feels a lot sturdier than the circuit and can use single-cycle waveforms to essentially become a synth. But it costs $70 more. Its sequencer feels a little outdated and, in my limited experience, it's just not intuitive. You could of course go for a Roland SP404, from which the rhythm clearly takes inspiration. The modern version, the 404A, costs $550, quite a bit more than then circuit. Its workflow might also feel a tad archaic if you reuse to more modern equipment. That being said, the SP303 and SP404 have legions of fans for a reason, they're undeniable classics. Then, of course, there's the other giant of hip-hop production, the MPC. As the cheapest option, the MPC-1 is still pretty expensive at $699, while the new touchscreen workflow has earned plenty of detractors. If you want an old-school beat-making experience you won't find it here, and the prices for vintage MPCs are out of control. If you're looking for the cheapest and most portable device with sampling ability though, I can recommend the $89 PO33 enough. It's not nearly as capable as any of the other devices listed here, but it can feel like a stripped-down SP303 that fits in your pocket once you master its quirks. The Novation Circuit Rhythm is a strong contender for best entry-level sampler. The learning curve is a bit steeper than some might have you believe, but once you've figured it out, finding your way around is simple enough. It's not the cheapest and it doesn't beat the competition on pure features, but it does strike an admirable balance. If you're looking to add a sampler to your setup on the cheap, or want to get started making hip-hop or house music without the need for a PC, this should definitely be on your short list.